Welcome back to The Division 2. In this video we are doing a loot test to figure out the best way to get loot in the game at the moment. The testing is the differences between the summit and the normal open world missions. If you are interested in this type of content, then make sure you subscribe to the channel, turn on bell notifications, as I quite often do data collecting and I gather stats and figure out the consistencies and the inconsistencies within the game. And I also want to put out a disclaimer before we get into the video and tell you that this is not a guarantee to be the same way every single time. There's a lot of RNG involved, but this is from a simple test I did. I tried making it as fair as possible to determine whether the summit is better or the missions in the open world are better. The results vary every single time due to RNG, but I would like to say that from this, summit can be just as good as the open world missions. So, when Title Update 11 dropped and we got the summit, it had a completely different structure to the way it works now. They released 11.1, they changed it all, and that's how it works. You can play with up to 9 directives, you can select your difficulty, you have to go from floors 1 all the way to 100, and then back through the entire mode again. I've spoken about the directives before. Each one only increases your targeted loot drop chance by an extra 3%, so a max of 27%, so it's not actually really worth it. It doesn't affect your targeted loot too much. There is possibly a little bit of a change, but it's more about the normal loot drops, because you can get targeted loot to drop by itself, but 9 times out of 10, it will drop accompanied by a standard piece of loot. So I run some tests because when they released 11.1, they made the changes to the summit. Loot wasn't really dropping at all. Players could go through several floors of the summit and only get like 1 or 2 drops. So even if they had 9 directives, that wouldn't increase their targeted loot drops because they wasn't getting general loot to drop. So I wanted to see which was better, and it seems as though it's just based on the normal inconsistencies, like the RNG part of the game. Because what I did was I ran 10 floors of the summit on heroic difficulty. Then I ran American History Museum 4 times on heroic as well. Always playing in a 4-man group, running exactly the same build. Absolutely nothing changed. I did 4 runs of American History Museum because the time totaled about 40 minutes. That's roughly how long it took me to do 10 floors of the summit on heroic. So I basically gave them a very, very similar chance to drop me loot based on the time played on that mode. And I based it off the summit experience, because if those 10 floors took 50 minutes, I would have done an extra run of American History Museum. If it took half an hour, I would have done 1 less run. But what I noticed from this was very weird, because I've been back in the summit since doing this, like getting the gameplay for this and taking note of it, and the loot has completely changed again. It's still exactly the same day. The loot and everything in the game hasn't reset. It's not been the daily reset or anything like that. But it just felt completely different, because on this run for the gameplay and this video, I actually got 3 pieces that were perfectly rolled. I mean, they had like double god rolls, but it was like a Providence mask that had weapon damage and crit damage. So I rolled a crit chance. That's a perfect piece. I had 3 pieces of gear that anyone would take out of the mode on the first run. Then after doing the video, or capturing the gameplay for the video and taking note, I went back in, barely getting any loot to drop. So yes, it's incredibly inconsistent, but the results of my test, the moment I decided to test it, within the 10 floors, including the boss's loot, the boss dropped 1 non-targeted piece and 1 targeted piece. But it took just over 39 minutes, so what we'll do is round it up to 40, because that's how long the American History Museum runs took. Targeted in the summit, I got 14 drops within 10 floors. Non-targeted loot, I got 19 drops. This wasn't including mods. So if targeted loot dropped and it was accompanied by a mod, that would only go down as targeted. This was literally just weapons and gear. So 14 targeted, 19 not targeted. Then I ran the 4 runs of American History Museum. This was only my loot as well. I was playing in a group of 4, but I was just tracking the stats and the data for my loot only. So in American History Museum, the boss was typically dropping me 1 piece of targeted, 1 piece of non-targeted. In total, I had 19 targeted drops and 19 not targeted drops. That were weapons and pieces of gear, so exactly the same amount of targeted and non-targeted from American History Museum, exactly the same amount of non-targeted from the summit, but 5 less targeted loot drops. So that leaves us with a big problem, because seemingly it's better to run open world missions on heroic, no directives or anything like that, because you do essentially get more bosses. You get bosses more frequently, because 4 runs would have totaled 4 bosses. If you run in Lincoln, that would have been 16 bosses. So there are more named enemies, a good chance of better loot, but at the same time, the problem with it, even though there were 5 more targeted drops, the biggest problem is the fact that the open world missions, you cannot select your targeted loot. So it leaves us with the question, do we want the extra targeted drops and more bosses available and stuff per like the amount of time you're going to be putting into going for loot? Or do you want it to be a more personalised experience, play the summit and choose your own loot? Personally, I would just wait until a mission you enjoy has targeted loot that you want, and I would run the open world stuff. Although it can be good for the summit to drop gear, but then as I said, I went back into the summit after this test and the loot was back to how it felt on the day of release of 11.1, and it was barely dropping. So I don't know if this was luck, my RNG was high, drops were just being nice. But overall, I would still say that open world missions are a little bit better than the summit. On that note, what we are going to do is leave the video there. Let me know all of your thoughts about it and stuff in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, leaving a like is always appreciated. I will see you in the next one. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.